Hello, we are going to start, so I will kindly ask everyone to take a seat, please. Okay, so it's 11 and 5 minutes. I think that we can start. Welcome everybody to this third plenary session of the 14th edition of the ADAPT International Conference. This plenary is entitled "What Do Workers Want Today? The Industrial Relations Perspective." And I am Ilaria Armaroli, a researcher at ADAPT, and I'm truly honored to be moderating this plenary session today, which is so central to the topics that we've been discussing since Wednesday afternoon, and also animated by such outstanding scholars with a long experience in the field of industrial relations, both at the national and international and comparative level. I am sure that almost everyone here is familiar with these distinguished professors and at least with some of their writings. An interesting thing that I would like to point out is, and an interesting thing that makes this plenary somehow indicative and somehow a mirror of the multidisciplinary character of industrial relations as a field of study is the fact that these three professors, during their careers, while all looking at industrial relations, worker participation, trade unions, they have done so from three different perspectives and methodologies. We have Professor Richard Freeman, the keynote speaker of today's plenary, who is an economist, holding the Herbert Asherman Chair in Economics at Harvard University, research associate at the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, and also faculty co-director at the Center for Work and a Just Economy at the Harvard Law School. We have then Professor Richard Hyman, who will speak as a discussant today, who is more a social and political scientist, emeritus professor of industrial relations at the London School of Economics, and founding editor of the European Journal of Industrial Relations. And then, last but not least, obviously, we have Professor Manfred Weiss, also a discussant today, who is a legal expert, emeritus professor of labor law at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. So I'm sure that the three different perspectives and methodologies that they applied to the study of industrial relations during their career will also inform their talks today. Having said that, I think that it is definitely time to start this plenary session, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone, of the entire audience here, when I say that we are truly excited and curious to hear the speeches of these three distinguished professors whose knowledge and experience will certainly enable them to analyze even the current changes in the world of work and even the new workers' preferences with key to interpretation that should not be missed. And that is why this plenary session is live streamed on our Adapt YouTube channel and will also be recorded in case you miss something, or also for people that couldn't attend this conference in presence here in Bergamo. So how do we proceed? The first speaker is Professor Richard Freeman, who will have up to 30 minutes for his talk, followed by Professor Richard Hyman and then by Professor Manfred Weiss with approximately 20 minutes each. So please, Professor Freeman, the floor is yours.
Yes. Well, actually, the floor belongs to the PowerPoint presentation, not to me. You'll see the title for this, and I will talk a little bit about IR, industrial relations, about human resource policies, law, social media, and AI as the key thing. Talk is made up of four parts and a conclusion. You can just see what they are. The one I will spend most time on, because I think it's new information to people and you will be excited by it. This is the ongoing spurt in unionism in the US among people like everyone in this room, highly educated folks. And if you're older, it's you when you were younger, because it's all led by young people. And I've got a big research project just beginning on this, so I'm very excited about that as well. Now let me see if okay. The four drivers, so we got to put this, we're professors, so we got to put this in some perspective. The first one that I think I made it first because I think it is extremely important. This is the technology, and that's the AI. And I went through the book of abstracts, and there's a whole chunk of papers in the thing. And at the session, there have been things all about AI. I looked back, and I said, well, how often did people use the phrases AI and future of work? In Google, in 2000, there were 30,000 mentions of that. In 2024, it's 567 million. This exploded, and it basically exploded in the last 10, 15 years. It's just gone out the roof. The U.S. National Academy of Science just had their newest publication. It's called Artificial Intelligence and the Future, and it's all about work as well. The other things are extremely important, and they may end up dominating the technology. We don't know. Aging is critical. There are some countries where people are going to disappear at a rapid rate, and particularly the once most populous country is China. And I will say something at the end of the talk about Chinese labor relations issues. And I keep thinking of, if the young people are getting fewer in number, and there are more and more older people they have to work to provide for, there's potential for some generational conflicts of a serious kind. Deglobalization, we just see that all over the place, and I'll just read that as pushing towards more nationalistic unions, and unions that will can differ more from a global unionization. So if I was someone working for a global union, I would be seriously looking at the problem of what does deglobalization mean for my union confederation or group. And then there's the authoritarian regimes. And there's two possibilities. They can target any form of independent unions as an illegal threat to the state, or they can try to set up their own unions as part of their authoritarian party. And Italy has an interesting tradition with Mussolini, and there are other countries have tried different things. So that's my drivers. I will say no more about them because I want to move. I will say a bit more about them in particularly about the ICT and the AI. That is what permitted the work from home being done during the pandemic. That technology saved millions of jobs in the US and the EU. It also divided workers in the US, and I assume the EU as well, but you would know better, between the white-collar people who could work from home and the blue-collar people who could not. So it's suddenly become what was a marginal thing in most countries. Mostly self-employed people worked from home, and other people didn't. And nobody said, I want to work from home desperately. This was not a big issue in collective bargaining, certainly, or elsewhere. And that has been done by the technology, has permitted that. There was a big issue with technology. They're videoing this lecture and video some other things at the conference. We're not worried about that. In China, where I was 2 weeks ago, professors said, we don't like them videoing our things. They started doing it during the COVID for a reason, but now we think that the government is looking over and seeing, did we say anything that went against the party line? And that's social science professors. I mean, if you're a math professor, I don't think the party can have any line at all. And then I want to say because one of the ways of looking at the new technologies is to say they're not a threat, but they're a possibility for the trade unions to make use of them and connect up with workers in different ways and build stronger unions. And when I was at the LSE in 2000, I worked with a wonderful young guy, Wayne Diamond, and we had a whole set of papers saying this. And we were working with the TUC, and that was clearly at least 20 years before the unions were prepared to do some serious thinking of, gee, how do we use this technology for our benefit? And for the firms, the same thing. How do you use this technology to connect to workers so it doesn't go through the union, so you can speak directly to people? Finally, we had a very interesting example of use of technology in the U.S. You may or may not know that the Teamsters Union, which has always endorsed Democrats for president, did not make an endorsement. And the leader of the Teamsters said publicly he surveyed members. The members preferred Trump. The leadership preferred Harris, and they made no comment. And I made a foolish comment to a friend of mine. I said, I wonder what kind of survey they did. I didn't trust this. Well, the survey turns out to be a totally legitimate survey and was more telling about how the election was going to go than a lot of other surveys. And that will come back as an issue. Okay. Now, the other place where the AI becomes important is we think about replacing workers. And I've always thought, do we need a president of a university? Do we need somebody at the head of a company? They have all these experts telling them, giving them advice, And they don't know that much about what really is going on. I don't want to insult any unionists here, but do you need the top person in the union et cetera? So what about bosses who become AI? And I found a set of surveys, a whole lot of workers, turns out, in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, think of, it might be better if I had a boss who is AI. And the big reason is, if you're a human boss, you've got well-known prejudices, favoritism, whatever it'll be. And the AI, we know, has some problems too, but presumably it's easier to correct the code on the AI than it is to correct on the people. So that's an issue. I found one study that went way beyond anything that's been at this conference that I've seen on this, which was, it's a group of US professors working with a company that tested who would be better, human management or artificial intelligence, in modifying workplace behavior. And it's with people who work at home. It's a question of getting them to schedule their work time more, let's say, rationally. And the answer you see in the bold here, and you can find the BBC article, and you can find the study. It's also referenced. So there's, which basically said, for a middle-level management who's supposed to be pushing you to do certain things that are good for you as a worker, and in this case, we believe it probably is good to be better schedule your work time in a logical way. The AI did as good a job as the human, and when they combined the two, they got the best job they could get coming out of this. And so that the AI is a serious potential for replacing some middle managers. I did not find a company that is studying replacing the CEO with AI, and if anybody can convince a firm to do that experiment, I think it would be wonderful. In any case, there's a whole set of work on this, and we should think of the current AI not as being replacing workers exclusively, but as actually replacing bosses as well, and workers see that as potentially good. Okay. And then we flip it around, though. We have human bosses may prefer AI workers. Just last week, I got this advertisement from Robotics Labs, and in today's Science News, there was reports of an article in Nature that said, hey, we've now got some experiments, and we find that if you do the automate with robotics, putting the chemicals together and then putting them through some machine to see what comes out, you can be much more efficient than human people doing this activity. So I just ended it. This is I ask you and I ask myself, would you prefer to work with a human or AI? And you might say, well, think of which human? That character who kept kind of talking too much at the meeting and pushing ideas that you disliked? Well, I'd rather have an AI. I can close it off. I can't close the human off. On the other hand, the humans at this point can be much more responsive. And the AI has hallucinations, we know. So it's a very interesting the way this technology will work itself out. Okay, now I want to jump to labor law issues, and there's a study or a data set that Cambridge UK has called Digital Futures at Work Research, and I found they index labor law. They actually use it on the basis of what the ILO puts out. The ILO is basically ILO data. And what we do see is labor regulation going up over the last 50 years. So labor law is not being outmoded by some other activities. And they leave off the most important laws, which were the public health laws that affected whether companies could be open. It had just huge impacts because it's not traditional labor law in this indexing system. But I would have said the laws are an absolutely critical thing, and the COVID laws generated some opposition from mostly conservatives, but other people as well, and has made some governments in the world less stable. People did not like being forced, not to go to their jobs, and being in China, they were locked in their apartments. If there was one case of COVID in a city like Shanghai, which has 20 million people, they closed down the whole city, and that people do not like that. So that's an important issue. The U.S., which is we'll turn to next, and I'll give you what I think is the most exciting thing that I have to say, has less labor laws, weaker labor laws by these codings than literally any other country in the world. And the comparison that the people at the UK people made was the US with Iran and Saudi Arabia. Of course, there is a question of implementation of laws and other things, but there's no doubt that the US has very contested labor law, which means it doesn't do as much as it might do in other countries. And we'll see how that plays out in a minute. Now I get to what I hope is the main message you will take from this. And you may or may not have heard this already, but the U.S. is going through a growth spurt in trade unions among people like us. And so I took the headline thing here, Union Boom in Higher Education, from the National Education Association. But it's everyone recognizes this. We've had a big rise of faculty being unionized. We've had a big increase in graduate student unionization. And the graduate student unionization and the unionization of postdocs is unprecedented in the country. If you go back to, I think it's 1996, somewhere back in ancient history, University of Wisconsin in the U.S. had a graduate union, and there was no others appeared for a long time. And now we are seeing a giant burst of this. And that's the point 3, and it's now spreading to undergraduates. Now, these are unions of students who are employees. So it's a teaching assistant. It's somebody who helps in the, let's say, as part of their scholarship, perhaps, but gets a job doing something in the school dining hall or whatever it happens to be. And these people are now unionizing incredibly. The impetus for part of this increase has been a legal decision. It's the 2016 Columbia University case where they said that student assistants working at private colleges are statutory employees and therefore covered by the Wagner Act. That's the NLRA. There was a big question about whether Mr. Trump, when he gets in, will fill the NLRA with people who will reverse this decision, and what the unions will do in this case. You can't forbid the unions, that's against freedom of association, but you certainly can say an employer is no legal obligation to bargain with them, no legal obligation to do anything with them. And 25 years ago, Yale University had a famous case. The students at Yale, for whatever reason, wanted to unionize very sharply. It's graduate students mostly doing TA things and RA, research assistants. And Yale just refused to argue with them. And they had votes, and most of the students favored the unions, and Yale said no. And at that point, the labor law was being interpreted as saying, you're a student first, the fact that you're an employee doesn't matter. You're a student, period. And if you understand what it means to be a student employee, is you're at this school, it's like being in a monopsony. It's the only employer you can possibly have. Harvard would get very upset if I hired students from MIT. They actually would connect to me and say, what's the matter? We should be having for your research project students from Harvard. And I could say, well, the better student was from MIT, and I want to get the best student. And there would be a tussle on this. So the big question we have in the next period of time is whether the NLRB appointees by Trump, he's not appointed anybody yet, and people have 5-year terms, so he'll get to appoint somebody next year and then somebody the year after, since they're rotating terms, and he could very well, and there will be a interesting fight at that point. But right now we're in this giant boom, and I want you to appreciate the nature of the boom. And in the last 3-4 years, it's reached a point of insanity, I would say. I mean, I don't mean insanity in a bad way either. I mean, it's just NIH, one of the biggest employers of scientists in the world. December 8, 98% of the NIH, these are postdocs, voted to unionize. You simply do not have anywhere in the U.S. experience a 98% vote. You have small numbers you're more likely to get, of course, a vast majority of small numbers. But if you look at Starbucks, where they'll have 10 or 12 employees in a coffee shop, you don't see 98%. There's just always some people who don't want to unionize for whatever reason, et cetera. And then we go to the medical school, University of Chicago. Also, this is now May this year. Again, it was 98% by chance, but a landslide vote of physicians, fellows, and interns to join the service employees union as so just gigantic desire for unions among young professional people in the U.S. I mean, just huge. This is also STEM. So the STEM part, people would say something like, oh, it's those humanities people who are causing all the trouble. No, this is STEM workers voting for unions in massive numbers. And then you say, well, the U.S. South that's where we're very anti-union. Duke University is a private university in North Carolina, and boom, not this summer, last year summer, they voted 1,231, and that's maybe 96%. I don't know. I didn't do the calculation. In the South of the U.S., whereas in 2016-17, just like 7 years earlier, 6-7 years earlier, the university just laughed when they tried to unionize. They said, no, go away. And they did not have this massive support. So we have a union contagion running through a lot of young Americans, which is, to me, stunning. I've not seen anything like that before. So how do we analyze, this is our project is how do we analyze this? So when you see these huge shifts in sentiment, the first thing, at least quantitative social scientist thinks of is contagion. And there are, some of you may be very familiar with this, social contagion models. that an idea suddenly sweeps. I talk to you, you talk to this one, that one, or some event occurs, somebody gets grievously assaulted by the police, and suddenly throughout the whole, a large part of society, people say we got to rein in the police. I mean, the U.S. has had that very recently as well. So what we're doing is looking at to what extent these contagious disease models will fit the social setting, because then you can use them to predict the future. Turns out there's two kinds of, I didn't know this until this summer, there's two kinds of models. There's the contagious disease that the biology epidemiologists use. There's a set of models, hypergraph models, and you see the reference here. And I've actually got a Brazilian student who's going to be working on hypergraph models. And lo and behold, where does the most important paper in this come from? It's from Italy and Spain. Scientists in Italy and Spain. And so someone said this is the most interdisciplinary conference that they know of. And, well, this made it more, 5 more minutes, fine. So that is the way we're trying to look at this. The question, if we get a sweeping movement of young people wanting to unionize, and it shows up in our Gallup polls that the most pro-union group in the U.S. are young workers, and if they manage to succeed, will this spill over to the rest of society? And so we've been looking at trying to understand, what do these young people do after they unionize? They now have had a union experience. Do they take that to their post-university job and say, I want to be union here too, because it gives me more freedoms and more ways of speaking collectively to the employers? And we're just looking at that. So we have a data set of 1,000 former student union activists and trying to see what do they do as they move along. You can connect them all up legally with no problem, because they all have their files on LinkedIn. And that's public information. There's no, et cetera. And so then at the end of this, I said, well, will Trump populism, will his appointment of a pro-union person to be Secretary of Labor mean that he or his group is going to go along with this and be more favorable to bring these people into his whatever his gang or his political movement? And what will the AI management and algorithmic management do for this? How is this going to play out? I don't know for sure. I will skip. I just want to say one. 2 more minutes? Okay. One, I just want to make one comment on China, and then I will be done. China has a very interesting way of dealing with labor disputes. They have a law that was passed in 2007, and I had some involvement in this law, which meant that every Chinese worker supposedly gets a contract they can have enforced in court, so that the employer is obligated to go by the contract. What was going on was rural workers would appear in Chinese factories. They'd be told they'd be paid a certain amount, and the company would not give them their last month's pay. And they would say, protest. And the company would say, how you get a protest? No way to go, and you got no information. And the rural workers basically were ripped off. So the law was passed, and what has happened has been a zooming disputes rising in China, people just running to the courts. Most of it is through lawsuits, which is a little there. The interesting part of this is you go as an individual, you do not go collectively. And this law was more subtly written than I would have ever realized when I was speaking with the Chinese about, was this a good idea? Okay, so That's an alternative. And it's connected with robots. The places where the disputes have risen the most has been with robots. That's all. I have my conclusion now. And so the conclusion is very short, obviously. You don't know who the shadow is unless you're an aficionado of 1920s or 30s comic books, which I assume not too many of you are. But basically, it just means we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And saying only the shadow knows means nobody knows. But we are in a business of tremendous change driven by the technology. We do have, in the US at least, the first time, a potential that we will see a burst of unionism that will bring the US closer to the EU and to other democratic societies with unionization. And I was happy when I went through this book of abstracts that Margarita sent me, yes, to see there are a lot of papers, some of them at the conference, some not, that people are starting to work on this. And I encourage more work on this because it is going to give us a real sense of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Freeman, for your speech that gave a very comprehensive overview of the main drivers of change in the world of work today. And it also gave us many insights on what's going on, not only in the US context, but also in China, reflecting your involvement even in this country. And there are many, many issues that I think would need another conference each to be properly deepened. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm particularly interested about the bottom-up process of unionization of graduate students and the medical staff and the relationship between this union and the more traditional union in the US context. But I think that we'll leave these this insight maybe for the later moment of Q&A with the audience. So I would like to leave the floor to Professor Richard Hyman.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd like to thank ADAPT for inviting me to this very stimulating conference. I think even more stimulating than the previous ones I've been at. And thank you for enabling me to share a panel with my distinguished colleagues. I'm listed as a discussant. I don't feel qualified in any way to discuss most of the themes that Professor Freeman has covered. So what I'm going to do is offer some reflections which I hope are complementary on the broader topic of the conference and this session. Right. This is my agenda. First of all, I think we have to look at what we mean when we say what do workers want today. So I will begin by doing that. Then suggest what most workers seem to want. 3 things: security, equity, and dignity. Talk about the role of trade unions. And 4 decades ago, Richard Freeman with his colleague James Medoff wrote a very famous and influential book, What Do Unions Do?, and talked about the two faces of trade unionism. I will talk about the many different faces that one can find when one looks across the world at trade unions. Rather pretentiously, perhaps, say something about what I think unions need to do to address the modern world of work. And finally, given that anger seems to be driving the ugly state of the world today, in what ways can we move beyond the politics of anger, and what more specifically can trade unions do in trying to address the anger of increasing numbers of workers. So, questioning the question, first of all, we have to say, I think, which workers are we talking about? And we've just heard that there are very specific groups of workers which have distinctive interests, distinctive orientations, and distinctive ways of engaging with the politics of work. It's important, I think, to stress that there are no average workers today. Maybe there never were average workers, but there was just an assumption that certain kinds of usually male workers in manufacturing industry were typical of the working population as a whole, which was never true. But I think one could argue that today there are even greater differences among the workforce in terms of labour market position, in terms of education, in terms of gender, in terms of position in the life cycle, and so on. And when we ask what workers want, we have to take account of these differences. Clearly the question is where, and survey evidence shows that there are very obvious cross-national differences in what different kinds of workers seem to want and how they think it best to achieve their needs and wishes. And there's a question, how different are things today? Clearly, many of the aspects, and those in particular that Professor Freeman has discussed in his presentation, many of these are simply issues, identities, types of work which did not exist a couple of decades ago. And clearly there are obvious differences there in what workers are, as well as what workers want and what they do. But despite the many differences in context, it seems to me that many of the priorities which we see in survey evidence seem to be relatively constant. And these are the issues that I indicated a moment ago. How are we doing for time? Most workers, not all, but most workers still seem to want security. They want a status, not just a contract, and the interaction between status and contract is certainly a very long-standing theme among sociologists, including economic sociologists. A situation in which labour is just a commodity is not one which most workers want, even though some can benefit if they've got particularly scarce and valuable skills. But for most of them, they are not just participants in a labour market. They are people who have a job to do and have a life to lead and have needs which they wish to be able to secure against a longer-term prospect. Most workers want social protection. In some countries, they see this as being something that should be provided by the welfare state. In others, they may see this as part of their employment package, and this is one of the important differentiations between the United States, where so many social benefits are employer-related, as opposed to most of Europe, where they are seen as part of the public regime. And perhaps above all else, most people seem to want a hope for the future. They don't want a vision of increasing precariousness. They want some stable point of reference for their working lives. Secondly, again, there's plenty of evidence that most workers in most countries want equity. They want fair treatment in good times so that they can have what they think is their reasonable share of growth and progress. They also want fair treatment in hard times, that they don't have to bear all of the costs, but that these too are equitably distributed. And when we heard about responses to the climate crisis, the demand for a just transition, that workers in old polluting industries don't want to be simply the victims of change. They want to be given a prospect of a better alternative, not just the scrap heap. Given that the workforce is increasingly diverse, most workers seem to want policies, whether through the individual employer or through the public realm, which takes account of diversity and inclusion, so that, for example, younger workers don't simply want to be simply the ones who are given short-term disposable contracts, while the older generation, to some extent, benefits from more stable, more longer-term contracts of employment. They want reasonable equity in the ways in which different groups within the workforce are treated. And they want decent work, as the ILO puts it. They want a balance between the demands of their employment and the demands of the rest of their life. They don't want a simple demarcation between work and real life. They want an interconnection between the two so that they are mutually complementary. And less substantially, workers want dignity. We talk about human resources, but people are human beings, not human resources. They are not simply means to other people's ends. They're people with their own aspirations, their own values, their own position in society. And I think in a conference like this, how we get people treated as human beings, not just as human resources, has to be a major priority for scholarly analysis. They want a sense of worth. there was a popular American book by Graeber some years ago called Bullshit Jobs, and which argued, perhaps slightly tendentiously, that a very high proportion of jobs today are ones which don't seem to have any social value, and that workers who perform them were very aware in many cases that this was true, that there was no, if they stopped working tomorrow, society would not be significantly worse off. Most people want to do work which they feel is important, does make a contribution to the well-being of society. And there is a lot of talk about voice. There is also a very common phrase, slightly chilling, "I hear what you say," and I'm going to take no notice whatever. They want effective voice, and they want some choice over their future. So it seems to me these are characteristics which have for a long time been true and are no less relevant today. The many different faces of trade unions. Trade unions differ very much across countries in their traditions and priorities. In a book which was mentioned yesterday, I suggested 3 ideal types oriented to market, class and society. And if one looks certainly across the world, one can find some unions which are more oriented to one ideal type than the other. There is the face, again, what do unions do, talked about the monopoly face and the voice or institutional face. Another distinction, which goes back a long time, is between unions' role as a sword of justice on the one hand, as a vested interest on the other. And there is a persistent tension between whether trade unions are primarily a social movement or whether they're a business-like organisation. And this tension can never be fully resolved. On the one hand, unions have to focus on workers' immediate needs and demands. On the other, they have to take account and try to represent less tangible needs, and on the broader social and economic framework within which they pursue their working lives. And they also have to engage their members in defining the priorities for trade union action. In other words, union democracy is absolutely vital if trade unions are to be effective organisations. And my final slide, beyond the politics of anger. More and more workers are insecure, and they are clearly aggrieved and angry. But as a very interesting recent study of right-wing populist parties across Europe by Halikopoulou and Vlandas has argued, insecurity is not destiny. How people respond to insecurity can take many different forms. What we see today, whether in many European countries or in the United States and more broadly, is that grievances are often captured most effectively by what I would call the entrepreneur of hate. They blame immigrants, they blame corrupt politicians, they blame fake experts. And unions and progressives more generally have not been very good in responding. if they're to compete effectively, they must push and push successfully for policies which address people's material grievances. And they must frame the issues and their answers in ways which are more persuasive than the simple sound bites of populist politicians. Unions have to recapture the arguments for freedom, justice, and social rights, which the far right has often been much more successful in colonizing. They have to offer a route map to a better future, and in place of hate, they need to offer hope. And I end with 3 images. Hope, not hate, is a movement set up 20 years ago in Britain in response to racism and far-right extremism, supported by many trade unions in Britain, and offers some ways of responding to the current challenges of an insecure workforce. This is an image with which probably many of you are familiar. And it seems to be very important because it combines the themes of resistance, of beauty, not a bomb, not a brick, but a bunch of flowers is what our terrorist is throwing. And the message, I think, underlying this is one of hope. And the flowers that he is throwing suggests to me a line which will be well known to most of you: sotto l'ombre di un bel fior. And that, I think, is a fitting note on which to end the song of which that line is part. Thank you.
Thank you also to Professor Richard Hyman for letting us deepening workers' preferences and workers' needs today, and also the struggles that trade union organizations are faced, I can guess, mostly worldwide, but also giving us some suggestions about a future agenda for trade unionism. Now it's turn of Professor Manfred Weiss. So the floor is yours.
No, you wanted to get rid of this machine. I hate it. Well, good morning. I am very grateful to be re-invited to my beloved conference, and I feel very privileged to be with my 2 prestigious colleagues on this panel. I have to start by disappointing you, because I have no pictures. I'm really old school. I still believe in the art of verbalizing. Well, as far as the question is concerned, what workers do want, I simply refer to what Professor Hyman said. I'm in full agreement with him, and I don't repeat it. I will focus on the question whether workers can get what they want. And here I'm coming close to what Professor Freeman would tell us about voice and representation. Of course, workers could wait until, theoretically, until the legislator would resolve their problems and give them what they want by protective legislation. This, of course, would be naive, because legislation always is unspecific, vague, and it comes too late normally because the technological speed is getting faster and faster and changing, and so until the legislator comes, it's much too late. Therefore, workers will be forced to rely on their own forces to fight for their interests. And this means, are there real possibilities of collective action, of voice and representativity? And as you will see, my message will be, I'm rather skeptical. It was never as difficult as it is nowadays. So let me ask, what can we do? And of course, I'm asking this question from the perspective of a legal scholar. So I ask, what can law do to facilitate voice and representation? Well, if we try to find an answer to this, it will be very difficult. I think I have to start by a quote from you, Professor Freeman. He once wrote, "Unions are mutable social institutions that operate differently in different institutional settings." And I couldn't agree more to what you said. This, of course, means that since unions are different entities in different settings and in different countries, we cannot have a unified framework for unions as such. But, of course, why? Oh, well, you want me this? Okay, so I take this. Whatever they want, I do. We cannot have a common legal strategy, but there are common elements for all trade unions, for collectivization as such. And the basic idea for me here is to finally take freedom of association seriously. What does this mean? I give you some examples what I mean by facilitating this. First of all, we should get rid of bureaucratic obstacles for founding trade unions. You cannot believe in how many countries we still have enormous bureaucratic obstacles which make it difficult for workers to really collectivize. This, of course, has to stop. The second very important message is that we have to establish easy access for workers to engage in collective bargaining. If you have, for example, obstacles as you have it in your country, where you have a majority rule it's almost impossible, you know, for trade unions to engage in collective bargaining. That's why we have such a low level in your country. But it's not only in your country. It's a little bit everywhere. I could give you lots of examples, but I don't have the time. And of course, we should not only give the possibility of collective bargaining to employees in a strict sense. We should also give such a possibility, for example, to self-employed, to the so-called solo self-employed. And if you look at this, well, you will see that, for example, the Court of Justice of the European Union has an archaic, outdated view of competition law. You know, they consider each self-employed, solo self-employed, to be an enterprise, you know. And then, of course, well, they run in problems when the question comes, should there be a possibility to collective bargaining, you know. They have totally misunderstood why competition law was founded. It was founded to make sure that there will be no monopolies having power on the market, you know. This, of course, is crazy. They have to change quickly this kind of outdated philosophy. Or, to give you a further example, we have to do everything to make the right to strike as strong as possible and only restrict it as far as absolutely necessary. And here we are in an area which is in enormous danger. I don't know whether you are familiar with the pending question now at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. There the question is discussed and will be decided soon whether the right to strike is part of the Convention 87 of the ILO. This for many years was, well, consented. It was no problem whatsoever. But you can see in what kind of a climate we have come. Now it's attacked. Now the employer side at the ILO says, no. It's not implied because it's not mentioned explicitly there. Formally they would say, when they still were the communist countries, you know, and you could attack them, then they would say, well, strike, of course, is implied, because in the communist countries, strike was forbidden, you know. But now, of course, well, this is no longer there. Now strike is attacked. And we don't know how the Court of Justice in The Hague is going to decide. If they would decide that it's not implied, this would be a catastrophe. To just show you that we have so many problems in taking seriously the freedom of association. And if we are not strong here as legal scholars and as those who have an influence on establishing a legal framework for collective activities, well, we might run in enormous problems. I'm not very optimistic, I can tell you. And there's not only the question of collectivization as such, it's also a question of Or let me say first something else. Whatever we might succeed in the legal field to facilitate voice, to facilitate collective activities, there is still an open question which has to be resolved. Whether it's better for the workers now, for example, for platform workers or workers who are still who are working in separate activities, to have separate organizations, let's say only an organization for platform workers, or whether to integrate in the already existing trade unions. I'm not sure what's better. Some would say, well, it's better to have your own organizations where you have people who are familiar with these new technologies and can also use tools of new technologies for strategies of fighting. But on the other hand, you know, we should not overlook that all this is a question of power, and that the existing trade unions which you might join are maybe more powerful than new associations. So this is an open question. Now, let me say a few words. I still have, you give me enough. On democratic workplace, we have talked quite a bit on democratic workplace already, but I can tell you there is nothing more important now than having a democratic workplace. The reasons were given already yesterday, so I don't have to come to this. We have learned that unilateral decision-making would be dramatic in the area where we come to the environment, to the decarbonization, but the same, of course, is true in the area of digitalization, and so on and so on. I don't want to give you examples because apparently I only have a few minutes. Well, I already told you that the legislator on the macro level cannot balance the needs between the employer side and the worker side. This has to be done on the micro level of the company, and there we need real participation in decision making. But the participation in decision making never has been so difficult as it is now. It is very urgent. First of all, of course, as we already heard yesterday, for the reason of human dignity. As long as workers do not have a say in decision making, they are mere objects. Only if they have a say, then they are treated as human beings according to human dignity. And of course, there is another aspect we should take seriously. And this aspect is the following. People in the era of digitalization and the era of decarbonization, well, they are full of fears. Fears of losing jobs, fear of losing the skills, and so on and so on. And in this situation, it's most important to have management decisions which are acceptable for the workers. And the acceptability, of course, is increasing enormously in the moment you have true workers' participation, not simply information, but co-decision making on the same footing. This, of course, has become difficult, enormously difficult. Why? Because for any sort of workplace democracy, you need specific preconditions. And we had excellent preconditions. The first precondition was very good for establishing something like this, to have a workforce working in the premises of the employer together. Everybody sees each other, everybody communicates with each other. This has gone. We have now individualization, isolation of workers. And this, of course, is very, very problematic. The second precondition was to have more or less homogeneous interests of workers. Well, in the fragmented workforce you have nowadays, you have such a huge difference of interests that it is extremely difficult to establish a mechanism of workers' participation. And thirdly, formerly it was very easy to know who is the decision maker, who is your employer. You may say that's still the case. I tell you, it's no longer the case. Company law all over the world has made it possible to create totally intransparent structures where you don't know anymore who is your employer and who is the real decision maker. In other words, we have not only to change, as I told you, labor law and competition law, we also have to change company law, because company law has, been shifted in a way which pleases, of course, the employer side. It's much more shareholder value company law than stakeholder value company law. So here we have another area where we see problems. In short, and to make the point, the preconditions for workplace democracy are eroding more and more and make it difficult to establish something like this. Okay, I'll stop. Let me conclude by saying, if we look at the conditions for voice in a fragmented, individualized, and isolated workforce, and if we look to the preconditions for functioning workplace democracy, we see there are enormous problems. And I'm not sure whether they will be resolved in the near future. I doubt it that it will be in my lifetime. Thank you.
So thank you very much also to Professor Manfred Weiss for suggesting us how not to create a new legal institution, but how to revise our existing legal structures and institutions to the service of today's needs, although your, I think, perspective is quite more pessimistic than that maybe of Professor Freeman that gave at the beginning of this plenary session. Now I would like to open the debate and also the Q&A session with the entire audience. So please, if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, okay.
Hello, Rebecca Gumbrow McCormick. Three actually very different presentations rather than commentaries. But I want to get back to Professor Freeman's very interesting analysis of the recent growth of unionization in the US among highly skilled university and scientific and health workers. It seems to me to resemble very much the arguments made by Serge Mallet many decades ago now in his famous book, La Nouvelle Classe Ouvrière, looking at, particularly in that case, technical workers and other white-collar workers, highly skilled white-collar workers, in leading a new labor movement, partly because they still had autonomy at work, and they had the motivation and the sense of self-confidence to lead a new labor movement. Do you feel this is, to some extent, a parallel? And in that case, is it something that is likely to lead to more unionization and activism among other workers who don't enjoy this same level of self-confidence or autonomy? I find it very interesting that this is a new wave in the US, whereas in much of Europe, public sector workers are already heavily unionized, and in particular university and other education workers. So, these are already well unionized, but the difficulty is getting those who are not official employees, but hourly paid workers, people teaching on a short-term contract. Those workers are not so heavily unionized, but are increasingly being. So I say this also as a union activist in my own union, University and College Union. So could this example from the US of these part-time workers who don't have secure contracts in education also be an example to those in Europe?
I think, yes, we can collect a couple of more questions.
Guglielmo Meardi, Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. Thank you. I found it fascinating, 2 presentations about all the important things that workers want, and the last one about workers not getting it. I think they are not contradictory, they are complementary in the sense that the prediction out of this is that workers are going to get very angry if all 3 presentations are right. But I have a question more specifically on one point. I'm very happy that everybody mentioned voice as a very important field in different ways, which is more and more important. But there is another aspect which used to be equally important, which has been mentioned only more indirectly, which is equality. So if it is true that, and I'm very happy about that professionals and knowledge workers are mobilizing and organizing. Sometimes they're very underpaid, but mostly they tend to be, let's say, better than average. Then the role that the labor movement has had until the 70s, basically in all countries, to foster equality is not automatically there. Actually, it might even have a role towards inequality because it protects those who are relatively better off. And also Richard Hyman mentioned equity, mentioned inclusion, mentioned fairness, but they're all relatively subjective concepts. He didn't use the word equality. So I really wonder whether the speakers think that workers still want equality, whether in the wage distribution or later through redistribution. I'm not that sure, and I would like to know whether the speakers think that workers today want equality.
Thank you, gentlemen, for these excellent presentations. If I make a summarize, pretty optimistic stake by Mr. Freeman. Maybe one extra driver I missed in your presentation, the whole climate issue. The other speakers were a little bit more pessimistic, and maybe I can confront them a little bit with 2 major facts. First of all, and I come back to the presentation I did yesterday on full employment, the return of full employment. There's no discussion that employment rate in the European Union is at a historical height. Many countries are in full employment or close to full employment. Not Italy, not Spain, but a lot of other countries. So that's one optimistic thing. And unions can do a lot with that. Secondly, and then more referring to Mr. Hyman, I'm absolutely not sure, Mr. Hyman, if it's true that nowhere in history so many workers are insecure or whatever. I doubt that figure. But anyhow, and there is no discussion on that, the share of open-ended contracts, or we could say in old language, the fixed contract, is also at a historical height. The share of temporary contracts in almost the whole of Europe, there are again exceptions, is at a historical low. So that should bring also some optimism. And I missed that.
I think that we can stop for this first round and allowing the speakers to reply to those comments. So.
Push. Let me push it twice. And now you can hear me, yes. Okay, good. The last comment and the first comment has some similarity because it's about the part-time and temporary workers. In the U.S., the part-time temporary academics do most of the teaching, and they are clearly at a high percentage, not the low percentage that you said for the EU in general. I would say that the union movement is, in higher education, is indeed spreading to the more contingent workers. And so it's the people who seem to be the less engulfed in this are the senior professors. So at Harvard, there's movements among the temporary, they just voted. The non-tenure track faculty who do a lot of teaching and other things, they just voted to unionize. And so there, I think there's a reaction among these workers, and because their position is similar to that of a postdoc. It's a temporary job. You don't have that on a tenure track. You don't want it, presumably, on that level. You want to become a senior scientist or something that has the equivalent of tenure, that you're there. So I think this is spreading. The hardest thing to say is, will it spread beyond these the autonomous people who have some autonomy at their job? And the closest that I know of something going on like that, it's also in the STEM area, where I do a lot of things in the STEM area. It's the people who run clinical trials. They tend to be largely women. I think it's like 70% of the workers. They're university graduates or two-year graduates, and they're finding the patients for the trials, making sure they do the shot or whatever it is they're doing to them, keeping the records and so on. And they are asking for more decision-making power against the PIs who are pushing very hard to get good results because their next grant depends on it. And I think it leads to some dubious science, and they seem to believe that. Right now, they're at the state of an occupational association, and they're not prepared to go the next step and seek a union. But the postdocs in the US, 10 years ago, I was advising the Postdoc Association. They said, we do not want to be a union, but we want to have our voice heard. And they learned that the voice being heard without the right to, without sort of strike, without collective thing, was not heard. And that they went the next step. So there's a potential, I think, for people to be led slowly to the. And someone said yesterday, we don't like conflict, so we first go to the management and say, hey, look, we got this problem, we got this issue, let's just resolve it. And that's a very non-contentious meeting. And then the management says, what was it? I hear you, and I've got to go to the board meeting. And the board says, get profits up. And sorry, you're resolving your problem. My heart lies with you, but I can't do it. So you got to have some power in the situation. And I mean, I would say our project, the last question, I just don't know how this could spread. I mean, it's spreading to the other workers in the higher education. It may be spreading to other workers in the healthcare area, in the clinical trials area. Whether it will spread beyond that is just, that's why these contagion models I'd like to see. We have one interesting result, I'll say. We have about 500 to 600 Starbucks that are voted to unionize, and they don't have a contract. And that's, until they get a contract, they can do it. It's really strong. They're paying their union dues, they're doing their thing, and the union can do really nothing for them, in the sense of without a contract. They're sticking, and the places where they are found most, these unionized Starbucks, are near universities. And the Starbucks employees in the US are very relatively young. They're the same generation or cohort as the postdocs and the graduate students. And we're going to have a project which goes and interviews them and talks to and tries to find out, is there really a contagion thing that you see it among other people your age? And they would not be, these are not people with master's degrees in general, so on. The other quick question was the question of equality. And I would say unions, just by collective bargaining, bring about more equality, period. Because a lot of at least in the US, a lot of the inequality is among different kinds of employers. Mm-hmm. And if you establish a group, be it an occupation or industry, there's just an immediate movement towards, I should be paid the same as that guy over there. In China, there's an interesting thing with this, is that you would have protests in one city in China, and the workers, not organized by the Chinese trade unions. Sometimes they would mediate and try to bring some outcome. But the situation gets resolved. They're not shooting people for protesting or working. And they would get something extra. People in other parts of the country with the same field, same occupation, would immediately know this through the internet. And they would say, the workers in Guangdong just got 30% pay increase, we should get that too. And these are people way, without the internet, this information never would have got to them. The Chinese press is not reporting this, but people just connect up through internet chat discussions and so on. So I think some of the equality may be formed or pressure will come through one group of people finds out another group gets it, says, well, they got it, why don't you give it to us too? And Chinese government, for all of its efforts to try to control everything, cannot control everything. And so that there is spreading things there. So I think there's potential for that.
I think I start with the question by Jan. Jan, I fully agree with you that in Europe we have now the highest participation of people in the labor market we ever had. Why do we have it? We have it in particular because there is a big, very big increase of participation by women in the labor market. And this is a good thing, you know, and this leads me already to the other question on equality. Yes, we do everything to try to get more equality and to get rid of these evident inequalities. And as far as the relationship between men and women is concerned in Europe, we now have this new directive on pay, which is not, let's say, the final result I would expect, but at least it is an important step. So, insofar, I agree with you. But you should not forget that in the moment in my country, in Germany, we stand before enormous collective redundancies in the automobile industry and in the steel industry because of management wrong decisions, you know. This is something we have also to see. But in principle, of course, you're right. There is an enormous level now we never have reached before. But I would warn you, I would ask you to not stay any longer in this Eurocentric perspective. When we talk about precarious work, we not only should look to Europe. I'm working, or no, I'm not working too much anymore, but before, I used to be working in Africa very much. I can tell you, and the same would be in Southeast Asia. I can tell you, you have employment rates enormously, 30, 40%, and you have about 70% informal economy, where you have no collective structures, where you have no voice, you know, where you have no representativity. You should see all this, you should see it in a global perspective and not only look at our little island of Europe, you know, which we take as a center of the world. This is no good, you know, we have to see globally. And I also would like to say, you also should look to Latin America, you know, a little bit everywhere. And you will see things are very, very different than they are in the European Union.
Okay, thank you very much. In some respects, I think both Rebecca and Guglielmo addressed the question, what is the relationship between different groups within the workforce and the unions which represent them. And that has always been a problematic question. Unions haven't necessarily been advocates of equality at all times and everywhere. And how one negotiates the relationship between different groups is partly a question of interrelationship between different representative bodies and to what extent they can get some sort of agreed sense of what is fair and equitable, which may not be the same as equal. And I think one of the key problems at the moment is related to the sort of right-wing populist notion of fake experts, or what Sandel calls the tyranny of merit. Mm-hmm. The notion, on the one hand, that having a university degree, a college education, a PhD perhaps, entitles you to a status and rewards far above the average, whereas this sort of hierarchy is no longer automatically accepted by those who don't have this personal background. And I think in many ways, for any development in the labour movement, that is the number one question, how one fosters solidarity there. And I don't have the answer. Certainly I don't have one that I can give in a couple of sound bites. Jan's question, pessimistic, moi? I try to end by suggesting there should be a message of hope. And I tend to agree with Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And unless one simply goes and commits suicide, I think in the world today, one has to find some basis for optimism of the will. And what I would respond to the specific question about insecurity. Insecurity is not simply, and perhaps not primarily, an objective question. It is a subjective question. And I think there is very much survey evidence, leaving aside Manfred's very important point that Europe is not the world. If you ask, do people feel more insecure today than they did 10 or 20 years ago? Do they feel that the expectation of rising prospects which their parents' generation had no longer is available to them? I think there is a very clear basis for saying that people are more insecure, and that this subjective insecurity fuels many of the unpleasant political developments in the world today, and that those of us who are looking for progressive solutions have to find an adequate way of responding. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for the questions from the audience and for the replies of the speaker. Unfortunately, the time dedicated to this plenary session is over, but the conference will continue with the lunch and then with another plenary session and also with the parallel workshops in the afternoon. I would just like to say something, which is I'm really thankful to these three outstanding scholars for bringing here to this conference their interesting views and quite complementary views, as also Guglielmo Merdi pointed out before, and the result of their long-standing experience and study, but also empirical research. And it is a real honor for us to hosting you and the fact that you've decided to bring your voices here at the ADAPT International Conference, and I know that it is not the first time for many of you, so thank again for your presence here. good.
Yeah, it worked out fine. It's good, good.
Maybe you will receive more questions like during the show.
With the wine, it's easier. I left aside quite a few things.
Okay.
Okay, you did a good job.